part of the reason that Gray had to keep his aircraft covered when he would go places like under a tent is because people would take a souvenir. They would literally cut little bits of the canvas from the wings off of the plane, which he needed that to fly the plane.
I'm no engineer, but it seems like that, yeah, be a key part of the plane. From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities.
The year is 1976. I was 7 years old, and I got to go along with my dad on a business trip. It was around the time we were moving from Albany to Washington, D.C., and I think we actually flew between those two cities. And really the only thing I remember about this trip was the flight itself. The airline we flew was called Mall Airways. Really, that was what it was called. You can look it up. There was a Mall Airways. And they flew tiny planes, like little Piper Navajos that held 8 or 10 people. And really, the highlight of the highlight was that the pilot let me sit for a few minutes in the co-pilot seat and hold the controls. I mean, like during the flight with other passengers on board. What can I say? This was a while ago. Anyway, it was pretty neat, and I have been a fan of Bernoulli's principle ever since. That particular trip, it's not really a high point in aviation history, but there were a lot of otherwise unassuming flights in this region that are worth remembering. Aurora Pfaff will hopefully not mind my calling her a flight nerd. She knows how to fly, but just as importantly, she knows her stuff when it comes to flight. And that stuff includes a veritable who's who of flight pioneers in this region. Pfaff is a writer and an editorial content manager who lives in the Adirondacks, and her latest project is a really cool and photo-intensive book called, appropriately, Aviation in the Adirondacks. It's filled with photos of early flights to places like Saranac Lake and Speculator and Piseco Lake. Thanks for coming by, or at least joining us over Zoom.
Yeah, thank you. It's exciting to be here.
Okay, I don't know where you grew up, but I gather young Aurora was into flight?
Yes, that's correct. Young Aurora was, from a very early age, completely fascinated by the world above, by deep space, by everything that is above us. Wow, that was articulated really badly.
Well, yeah, do you remember where that came from?
I honestly don't. I just remember from a very early age, my mother would have a hard time finding me, and she'd find me out in the backyard, in the dark, looking up at the stars. It was just something that was always a part of me, that fascination with what's up there, wanting to be up there, wanting to travel, and something about the buoyancy of flight or the freedom, I think, was just always really appealing and alluring to me.
Was there a high water mark for that in your childhood? A trip to the Air and Space Museum, or Space Camp, the Blue Angels, something like that?
I always wanted to go to space camp. Always wanted to go to space camp. Never made it. I had to do a report on Sally Ride when I was in elementary school, and that was the point where the massive obsession set in of reading about astronauts and wanting to go to space and wanting to take flying lessons. Flying lessons really weren't a thing. I grew up in Plattsburgh, and there were no flying lessons in the area at the time. Given that I was a child, my mother probably would not have allowed it anyway.
It's funny because there was an Air Force base there, wasn't there?
Yes, there was. There was an Air Force base. And I think there was a time when there certainly were lessons in the area. At the point that I was in that critical age of wanting to do such a thing, it wasn't an option. But yeah, that really always stuck with me. And there's just something powerfully beautiful about flight that I think is so appealing, and for a writer to almost be inarticulate about it, I think says something about the joy and the magic and the intense freedom that comes with flight.
You hear that sometimes the I don't know that it's a criticism of the space program, but the first people into space weren't poets; they were test pilots, and their ability to put into words what it was like to be beyond the bonds of Earth was challenged, even for people who flew all the time. And it's interesting to think about what it would have been like if a poet or a writer had been sent into space.
Oh, absolutely. One of my favorite astronauts, who just passed away a couple of years ago, was named Alan Dean. He walked on the moon on Apollo 12, and he became a painter after he retired from NASA. And I read in interviews where he said, "Look, next time, don't send a geologist, don't send an engineer, send the artists, send the poets, because they're the ones who can translate this really transcendental experience, of an extraordinary experience." You think about, at one point, Michael Collins, who was a command module pilot on Apollo 11, he was all by himself in the whole enormity of space. There's everyone else on Earth, two guys on the moon, and this one man orbiting the moon. And he had a beautiful experience. People said, he's the loneliest man in the world or whatever. And he really contradicted that because he got to have something extraordinary.
He kind of lived David Bowie's Major Tom life for a time.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Or maybe Peter Schilling's Major Tom life, depending on which Major Tom you're into.
And lucky him, right? That's an extraordinary experience, that to see the moon from such an angle, from such close proximity, and to see the Earth from space. I think it's all quite powerful.
Okay, so fast forward, you, as far as I know, did not become an astronaut or a payload specialist or a test pilot.
I did not.
When did the book, your contribution to flight, start coming into focus for you?
It really has only been about a year. I have been working on my writing career for a few years, and happened to get this idea. I have other books by this publisher. They're nice books. They're really full of interesting history. There are a number of good ones about the Adirondacks. And I just thought, well, wait a second. No one's written about this. Why hasn't anyone written about this? And so it was honestly, a fast process of having the idea, looking to see if anyone else had done it, putting in a proposal, and going from there. And it really was truly in April of 2023 that I put the proposal in with the publisher.
Wow, start to finish in a year.
Yeah.
How much did you already know about the early history of aviation in the Adirondacks when you put that proposal? Hardly anything.
Hardly anything. Hardly anything. I really was, I started just out of curiosity doing research, just for myself, for fun, because I'm an annoyingly curious person. And I like to have all the answers. And that's when I thought, okay, there could be something in this. There could be a book in this. And I learned a lot. I learned so much. There's still more to learn, but I really was not an expert. I can recite, Apollo crew manifests straight through, and I can talk to you about a Bell X-1. But aviation in my own backyard, so to speak, was something new to me. And now I know a fair amount about it, and I think it's full of beautiful, wonderful stories.
Well, and lucky for you, there are a lot of stories and a lot of pictures. I mean, it seems like the way you took this project on, and the publisher that accepted your proposal, is really kind of the ideal way to tell the story of flight. It wouldn't be what it is without all of these photos.
Absolutely. And in some ways, I was intimidated by that. I had to find a certain number of photos, which was a little pressing, so to speak.
There's a requirement, a minimum number of photos you can pull together.
Yeah, that's one of the things. With Arcadia, they're great to work with. I've worked with a number of people there in the last year, but that is one of the things. You have to have a certain number of photos, and at times it's more intimidating than you might think. There are a lot of great photos out there, but sometimes finding a story in it is really the key. Also, I found plenty of photos that I just didn't feel I could use, but I also found photos that absolutely tell a story within them. There's the photo that has even photos that we don't know who the people are in them, or a photo of a specific plane in the air, and you find out later that it belonged to a certain person who kept it for 50 years and was known for giving kids free flights around the Adirondacks. These are all the stories that are within those photos are really something special. And it is a nice way to tell the story. Flying itself is very visual. Being up in the air is very visual. So to be able to share that with readers is pretty exciting.
So where did it all begin? What is the first documented flight in the Adirondacks?
October of 1912. A young man in his 30s named George Gray landed a Wright Model B in a farmer's field in Vermontville near Saranac Lake. And he was brought to Saranac Lake sort of as a publicity entertainment kind of event by a local entrepreneur who was a little eccentric himself. And that was the start of it all. Was he landed this very bare bones airplane, and people rushed out to Vermontville to see him when they heard that this airplane was in the area. And he flew flights over Saranac Lake to demonstrate, and that was the one seed that led to many others.
You said Wright Model B, and for people who can't see the word in front of them, that's Wright with a W. You can draw a straight line from the Wright brothers to this plane that landed in Vermontville.
Yes, from the plane and to the pilot. In fact, Gray was trained at the Wright School of Aviation, Wright Flying School in Ohio, which was started by the Wright brothers. So not only were they behind the aircraft, but they were behind actually teaching the pilot himself.
We should also note that he landed in Vermontville. That was not where he intended to land, right?
No, no, he was heading for Saranac Lake. Adirondack weather, as a lot of us know, can be unpredictable. He was in the vicinity of Whiteface, and he was facing bad weather. Didn't really exactly know where he was, but knew that he needed to get down on the ground pretty soon. That plane only had a range of about 100 miles. So depending on how far you've gone, you have to be cognizant of that. And he was close. He was pretty close, but didn't quite get to Saranac Lake the first day.
The plane had a range of 100 miles, which seems kind of amazing considering less than 10 years before that was the first flight, which went, I don't know, a few hundred feet.
Yeah, it's kind of astonishing. I would have to do some research, but I feel like that is a really big, impressive leap, no pun intended, between the first Wright brothers gliders and then their first powered plane, which got off the ground and was aloft for less than a minute, to then 9 years later, here's this guy who's been to their flying school. He's flying a plane they helped design, and he's going all over the country in it. And that's what a lot of people were doing. People were finding the money to get themselves planes and going off barnstorming and trying to make a living at it, which is astonishing in a way.
You mentioned it was an entrepreneur who brought George Gray there in the first place, and it seems like the early history of flight in the Adirondacks is really about the novelty of it. You have lots of pictures in this book of the big crowds that turn out to actually just see airplanes.
Yeah, it's something that seems so strange to us now, that aircraft are such a big part of our everyday life. People use them to commute. People use them for work all the time. We see them flying overhead, and we don't even think twice about it. But this was a time when they were so new, so very new. And to even be in a place like Saranac Lake or Racket Lake and have this craft show up in your town, that you could see it and you could look at it, it's astonishing. And it's something that brought communities together and really was an element of excitement. Part of the reason that Gray had to keep his aircraft covered when he would go places like under a tent is because people would take a souvenir. They would literally cut little bits of the canvas from the wings off of the plane, which he needed that to fly the plane.
I'm no engineer, but it seems like that, yeah, be a key part of the plane.
Yeah, you need your wings to be an all in one piece, and people were so amazed to shake his hand and to hear about his adventures and to see this plane. It really is something that I think we would have to for us to find an analogy now would almost be like a spacecraft or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there are pictures of people just posing in front of airplanes. Like, isn't it cool? Look at me. I got to stand in front of an airplane.
Right, right. Like the sort of thing that we would do nowadays with maybe a Lamborghini or something like that. People were I posed in front of an airplane. And there are a lot of photos out there like that. There are photos that we don't know if the person even went on the flight, but they were amazed to see these things and amazed to see them in their small towns. I think it's important to remember that we're talking about very small towns in an area where there's still pretty small towns, but it was a big deal for a lot of people.
Speaking of excitement, I can't let the opportunity go by without asking how it came to be that a car raced an airplane in Saranac Lake.
That was I don't know for 100% certain, but I do believe that was all Caribou Bill, who was the entrepreneur who brought Gray here and offered him a certain amount of money to do these demonstration flights. I'm quite certain that that was a stunt on behalf of Caribou Bill as a way to make a little bit more money, charge people admission to the racetrack, to watch this wild race happen between a car, which we should remember this was 1912. So the car itself wasn't all that sophisticated, much less the aircraft. So it was kind of an interesting race between the two of them, one in the ground and one in the air. And the fact that I'm just endlessly amused that the car won.
And there's probably the specter of death hanging over the whole thing, too.
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you're considering that part of the reason the plane lost was because he was trying to make these tight turns on the over the racetrack, and it's not exactly a sophisticated aircraft at that point.
So when or maybe how does flying go from being this novelty to being a really important part of life in the Adirondacks?
I would say almost immediately, within just a few years of Gray's flight in 1912, people were very clever about not just seeing this as something to do for fun, but as something that could transform how people got around and really transforming how we access the wilderness.
I was going to say, it really makes the parts of the Adirondacks seem much less remote.
Yes, very much so. There are many places in the Adirondacks that for a time, the only way you were going to get there was you were either going to bushwhack or you were going to paddle, and it could be a very long adventure. And suddenly you have this possibility of a plane can take you somewhere. And early on, there were no real landing strips. It wasn't exactly that we had these paved landing areas for planes to go. So people like Gray were landing on fields. They were landing wherever they really could find a spot that seemed relatively flat, which is not always easy in the Adirondacks. But people were very industrious about how they could access different places and how they could go from place to place, and do it in a much faster, not necessarily safer all the time, but definitely a faster way, and getting into those nooks and crannies that are otherwise pretty inaccessible in a much easier fashion.
Well, and of course, one sort of guaranteed flat place were the lakes that seaplanes were able to land on. And some of these lakes seem like they become really important places in aviation, places like Long Lake and lesser known places like Piseco.
Yes, very much so. I didn't even realize until I was doing this research that there is still an airport in Piseco, right on Piseco Lake, practically. It's tucked in between the lake and some mountains, and has some tricky winds, I'm told, for landing. But places like that, it really made a difference. And all of a sudden, you were starting to get people who owned hotels who thought, we're just going to get a plane. We're going to hire a pilot. We'll keep the float plane docked right outside the hotel on the water. We'll give people scenic flights, or we'll go pick people up in different places and bring them to the hotel. And that transformed vacationing in those areas, especially.
There's a really cool picture in this book of someone who didn't really make a name for themselves flying in this area, but did make a name for themselves flying in general. Amelia Earhart actually spent time in the region, and the picture of her is, it's so artistic.
Yes. Yeah, it's a great photo. I think, the dream would be to say, oh, yes, Amelia Earhart flew in the Adirondacks, and here we have this great photo of her in her flying jacket. That's not the reality, but the reality of what did happen, I think, is still pretty interesting because here's someone who was at the time just an ordinary girl on vacation with her mother. And it's really just a snapshot of her at Lake George, where she and her mother were renting a cabin or cottage. And she's sitting sort of silhouetted in front of the window. And she's got that distinctive, messy, short haircut, sort of sticking out all over the place. And there's a cat with her. And so this really sort of sweet silhouette of a young woman relaxing and enjoying a peaceful moment in a part of the world that we all know really well prior to this big, exciting life that she would lead as a pilot and ultimately tragic, I think I think it's kind of poetic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a picture that could be of anyone, but that it is of Amelia Earhart. Just it's a goosebump moment.
Yeah, I'm glad you think so. I think that's one of those things where you, as a writer, you think, do I really want to include this? Should I? Is it as relevant? But I'm glad that I did because I do think that that's one element of the overall story of aviation in the Adirondacks, of the people who did fly here, who had some sort of transformative or interesting moment in the Adirondacks.
All right, so you alluded to this. You have flown here. There
Yes.
is a big difference between loving the idea of flight and researching people who flew 100 years ago and becoming a pilot yourself. When did that inflection point happen in your life? What was it that convinced you that, okay, I'm going to slip the surly bonds of Earth?
I love that quote. I'm so glad you used that. That's one of my favorite quotes to use. Um, it had to do with work. I had wanted to take flying lessons for many, many years. It just never happened. There were a couple of times when I got as far as scheduling something and it just fell through. It didn't work out. And uh, a friend of mine from work went on a flight with a local company, Adirondack Aviation Academy, that operates out of the Lake Clear Airport here in Saranac Lake and also Lake Placid. And he went on this flight and he wrote about it for work and asked me to review the writing. And I was so taken by his expressions. And this is somebody who's not a professional writer, but who was just being honest about what that experience was like and the excitement. I really said in that moment, I have to do this. This is something I have to do. And I immediately signed up for a first introductory lesson and found it to be an exceptional experience, perhaps even more so than I anticipated.
So the reality really met the anticipation.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. I think it's different for everyone. I've spent a lot of time in the last year, even reading about contemporary pilots, people who make it their career, working for airlines, bush pilots. It's really an interesting thing, the different reactions people have to that experience. And I was fortunate enough to do it with maybe the right instructor, maybe it was the right time, the right plane, and find that it was a simply exhilarating experience. It's almost hard to describe. You have this balance of gravity and lift and you're just this little insignificant thing kind of floating up in the air, bobbing along on the currents of the wind. That it's profound and it's exciting,
And
slightly terrifying at times.
and you've gone on to take more lessons than that first one.
Yes. Yeah, I've taken a few lessons. My last lesson, which was probably about a year ago at this point, did actually, with some help, land the plane on the runway. And my instructor is a great guy. His name is Mike. And he kept having to tell me to sort of relax my grip on the yoke because I was really white knuckling it, It's hard. It's hard because you feel like, okay, at any moment I could kill us. And getting over that feeling is an unusual experience. And it's not easy, but it's all part of the training, I think, a part of giving yourself up to flying, giving yourself up to working with the plane. Yeah, I've enjoyed my lessons very much. I tend to want to spend more time just looking out the window than I necessarily do finessing my skills, which I think is to my detriment as a student, as a potential pilot, because it's just so beautiful up there, especially when you're in a small plane. It's just you and one other person, and you're just looking around at all of this amazing gorgeousness that is the Adirondacks. It's very special.
Do you think you would have had that same feeling? You would have fallen for the experience of flying if not for the location, if you were working in Kansas or or Nebraska or something? I mean, is this wrapped up in the Adirondacks for you?
I think it probably is wrapped up in the Adirondacks. I think I would have enjoyed it. I have been to Nebraska. I'm not particularly fond of that state. No offense to Nebraskans. It's a little dull to drive across it, as I have done.
And it's a little long to drive across it.
Yeah.
I would think a plane would be the perfect way, but
No, and I do think that there is something about being in the air in that context that I feel like the rest of the world feels big and small all at the same time. And so do you. You feel big and small all at the same time. I do think that the Adirondacks, by virtue of the mountains and the winding rivers and these small lakes, there's something very special about that geography that I think makes a huge difference. Absolutely. So I think had I learned to fly a plane in Nebraska, for example, or Kansas, I probably would have still enjoyed it. I don't think it would have been as meaningful of an experience for me.
Well, Aurora Pfaff, it's thank you for sharing that meaningful experience and all of the experiences that come together in this book. It's been fun to talk with you and fun to vicariously imagine what it would be like to pilot a plane without necessarily the terror that I'm sure I would feel.
You're very welcome. And thanks so much. It's been a really great experience to chat about it and to share some of these stories.
And congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I hope this will be the first of many, I hope.
Aurora Pfaff's book, which will be out in the coming weeks, is called Aviation in the Adirondacks. You can see some of those old photos and find a link to a conversation and a slideshow about her book and much more at ncpr.org/northwards. Ethan Shanty helps fly our plane here at Northwards, and he's going to do some spoken skywriting and share the names of the people that make this show possible.
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, edited, and produced by Mitch Tyke with digital production supervision by me, Ethan Shanty. Caitlin Kelly handles our social media, Bill Hanel is our digital director, and Doyle Dean is our production manager. Music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. To support this show and find more podcasts, visit ncpr.org. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.